Good afternoon. Let's do some business. We are doing it live right here. Weekday afternoons at 4. We get right down to business with the news-driven hour after Ben Shapiro and just before the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang at 5. Mottek On Money, live on the air on 790 KBC, streaming live online worldwide at kbc.com, and your on-demand Mottek On Money podcast, kbc.com, Apple, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Stocks ending higher today, a day after the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell played down stagflation fears and said a rate hike at the Fed's next policy meeting was unlikely. Also, corporate earnings are back in focus, with Apple taking the spotlight on its earnings news today. The Dow coming in for a closing gain of 322 points to settle at 38,226. The S&P 500 moved to 46 points, and the Nasdaq powered back up 235 points. Tensions in the Middle East are continuing. Oil, though, ending on a mixed note today with prices lower here in the U.S., global prices moving higher. We did see the price of crude in New York edging down by 5 cents to settle at $78.95 a barrel, yet below $80 a barrel. In fact, the lowest we've seen since March. Brent crude in London, the global benchmark, moving slightly higher, up 23 cents to $83.67 a barrel. Gold futures making modest moves after rising sharply following the Fed's decision to leave benchmark interest rates unchanged for the time being. We see a gold trading at around make that $2,311.30 an ounce, up 30 cents. Crypto is making dramatic moves lately lower. Right now, Bitcoin is just above 59,000. Apple shares up about 7% in after-hours trading after the iPhone maker reported second quarter earnings that topped analyst expectations, and they announced an expanded stock buyback program. Apple stock today it closed up nearly $4 at $173 and change, moving up about $10 now in after-hours trading. In the business of show business, we see Sony Pictures and private equity firm Apollo Global Management reportedly sending a letter to the Paramount Global Board expressing interest in acquiring Paramount for about $26 billion, according to people familiar with the situation talking to MarketWatch. That expression of formal interest coming as David Ellison's Skydance Media, backed by private equity firms Redbird Capital and KKR, await word from Paramount's special committee on whether the panel will recommend its bid to acquire the company to controlling shareholder Sherry Redstone. China back in the news, helping shift the battlefield momentum in Russia's favor in Ukraine by providing it with components and other material needed to sustain its defense industry. This according to top intelligence officials on the Capitol Hill today. They said Beijing's assistance comes as Russian forces make progress in Ukraine, and Moscow attempts to increase pressure on Ukraine by bombing the country's critical infrastructure. This according to the Director of National Intelligence at a hearing of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The U.S. now imposing sanctions on more than a dozen companies in China and Hong Kong for their support of Russia's war in Ukraine as part of an effort of nearly 300 new sanctions unveiled this week. I'll discuss all things China with our go-to China expert, Gordon Chang, who will be joining us live later this hour. It's day 210 now, the war between Israel and Hamas, which started October 7th after Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, leaving at least 1,200 people dead and more than 100 people still being held hostage. Tense times at many universities, including right here in Southern California. Police removed barricades and began dismantling an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian fortified protest encampment early this morning, overnight, at the UCLA campus after hundreds of protesters defied police orders to leave. About a day after counter-protesters attacked a tent encampment on the campus. Another night of clashes last night involving protesters at UCLA with police making arrests. I'll discuss what's happening out there with the Honorable Dennis ZINE, former L.A. City Council member, former LAPD sergeant, and still an LAPD reserve officer. Dennis ZINE will be on the line live with us later this hour. But first, on your money, the markets and the economy and the whole works. Joining us live now, Paul DIETRICH, Chief Investment Strategist at B. Riley Wealth Portfolio Advisors Management, happens to be based here in Los Angeles. Paul DIETRICH, thank you very much for taking the call here this afternoon.
Thank you, Frank.
And thank you for your thoughtful analysis always. I know you've posted your recent analysis on the markets on your website recently, and we'll get the details on that certainly. But first of all, big week with the Fed and more market volatility lately, and market seems to be hitting a downdraft following that big start to record highs earlier this year. Give us your view of things here at the moment.
Well, you know, April was a down month for the market. I think May is going to continue a lot of volatility. but I think in the end it's going to be a down month also. We had a good day today in the stock market, but I think a lot of economists and analysts and financial people are trying to put lipstick on a pig because nothing that Jerome Powell said yesterday is really good for the stock market in the long run. We forget that about 2.5 months ago, 3 months ago, we were expecting 6 rate cuts starting in March this year, and now, maybe there's going to be 1, but more likely there's going to be 0 rate cuts. And keeping rates high and higher for longer, as Jerome Powell was saying, that's going to keep mortgages, above 8%. Credit card interest rates are going to continue to be 25-30%. Auto loans are going to be higher. This is going to keep costs high. This is not going to allow inflation to really go down significantly. We've now seen 3 months of inflation. All 3 of the inflation measures that the government uses have turned up in the last 3 months, and I think inflation is going to continue to go either sideways or slightly up in the short term, but in the long term, with deficit spending in Congress where they're just printing money like we've never seen before, even during periods of war in World War II and Vietnam War, that is going to cause long-term inflation. And although Jerome Powell yesterday said he doesn't see stagflation in the short term, we're certainly going to see it in the long term.
On the air live with Paul DIETRICH, Chief Investment Strategist at B. Riley Wealth Portfolio Advisors Management. And thank you for that thoughtful analysis here, Paul DIETRICH. And certainly there is upward pressure on inflation, especially as we've seen at the gas pumps. And the other metric we got recently, this past week, was the consumer confidence number, which has taken a hit. And no surprise, as gas prices move up, we've seen consumer confidence move down in the past. What about with ongoing tensions in the Middle East? A lot of concern here about where the price of oil goes from here. It did pull back recently, now just below $80 a barrel. But what do you see ahead on that front?
Well, that's the roll of the dice. That's the unknown is what's going to happen in the Middle East. And people don't quite realize that Iran, if it wants to shut off oil to Europe, it doesn't have to actually take down a tanker or anything like that. All it has to do is shoot, a missile into the Straits of Hormuz, and the insurance companies, all these billion-dollar tankers have to have insurance, and no sane person is going to, take risk if they don't have insurance on those billion-dollar tankers. And that would pretty much cut off all the oil from Saudi Arabia and the other Arab countries up there that export oil and natural gas primarily into Europe. And so it would be the insurance companies that would take down the oil transportation, and that could happen, unless you know what's in the minds of the Iranian generals, which I don't know anyone who does. It's the biggest risk factor that we have right now. And, cutting off oil to Europe, especially going into the winter, that could cause a worldwide recession.
Certainly, and with Iran playing with fire by attacking Israel recently, tensions are extremely high. There was one retaliatory strike. It remains to be seen if any more are going to be coming. As far as inflation is concerned, and you mentioned those credit card rates now 25-30%. What about that official inflation reading, which is still hotter than what the Fed wants, but just a lot of discussion now with those credit card rates so high, how inflation is even calculated. Apparently, those credit card interest rates aren't even part of the equation. But look at individual inflation; it is off the charts these days.
Yeah, anybody who's gone to a grocery store knows, that everything seems like it's going up higher. But it's not just the credit card rates that people are paying 25-30% of their credit card in debt every year. But we're also seeing for the first time credit card limits that large numbers of credit card holders, especially at the lower end of the economic scale, are reaching their limits. Well, we know what happens when you reach your credit card limit. They just cut you off. And what we're seeing, and you can see it so clearly even in the earnings of a lot of retail organizations, that people are becoming much more careful in their spending. You've seen Starbucks earnings just sink, eBay, Etsy, restaurants like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, KFC, even Expedia, which is, travel and airline travel, we're starting to see slow significantly. GDP went down almost by half this last month. I mean, it really dropped. And so you're seeing, Amazon and Walmart did well, but they're almost kind of like utilities. You buy everything you have to with them, but it's all that discretionary spending with restaurants and travel that we're now seeing for the first.
We're all juggling life, a career, and trying to build a little bit of wealth. The Brown Ambition podcast with host Mandy and Tiffany, the budgetnista, can help.
When it comes to navigating your career, it really isn't a linear path. You just have to make the best choices with the information that you have at the time and just trust in the journey. Our job security is ourselves. It is our ability to bounce back. And if there's one thing that I've learned is that I'm always going to rise to the top.
Brown Ambition, wherever you listen.
Time really slowing, hitting earnings. And once consumer spending starts going down because they have to pay for the essentials, that's, then you start seeing jobs losing, people starting to cut jobs after that. And that's usually, by definition, slowing consumer spending and unemployment going up. That's almost the definition of a recession.
All right. The last thing people want to give up usually is their cell phone. And Apple in the spotlight today, shares higher in after-hours trading. Looks like iPhone sales have been slipping lately, but they did come out with earnings that exceeded analysts' expectations today and announced an expanded stock buyback program. Apple, of course, one of the Magnificent Seven names. What are your thoughts on Apple and their news this afternoon?
Well, I thought it was pretty much consistent what I was saying. Almost all of their growth, and it was spectacular growth, was in services that that Apple gets from selling apps and in-app purchases, things like that. But if you looked at the growth of Apple iPhone sales, they really slowed significantly. So again, you're starting to see, people don't seem to be cutting back on their subscriptions for apps that they use and pay for, which part goes to Apple, but they are slowing their new purchases on Apple products like the iPhone.
All right, I think since we last spoke, gold had hit a record high. What are your thoughts on gold here?
It's going to continue. People, when you really get down to it, smart institutional international investors, they don't believe for a moment that Bitcoin offers a lot of real underlying value. Whereas gold has been a store of value for thousands of years. And you're not only seeing central banks buying up more gold rather than dollars, simply because Congress is spending like drunken sailors. I don't mean to disparage drunken sailors, but, Congress is just, it they're devaluing the U.S. dollar almost every 100 days by about $1 trillion. And so people are going to safety, and safety is gold, and I expect it to continue to do well.
At this point, Paul Dietrich from B. Riley, let me ask you the big question that we ask here, and that is, where are you putting money now and or taking it off the table?
I'm putting it in short-term treasuries. 2 to 3 year treasuries are at about 5% yield, which is pretty good. And I'm increasing gold, and I'm hedging with some investments in oil, long oil and gas, just simply because of that risk factor we talked about earlier, that I think is a very high risk factor because of the Middle East conflict. But I've got over 20, almost 25% of my portfolios in gold right now.
Are you coming out again to Beverly Hills for the big B. Riley Investors Conference coming up again soon?
I'll probably be out there. I'm not sure yet, but probably.
Hope so. Hope to see you out here, and it'll be wonderful to roll out the red carpet for you again when you get out this way. Thank you very much, Paul, for that thorough update on what's happening with the markets and the economy. We've been speaking to Paul Dietrich, Chief Investment Strategist at B. Riley Wealth Portfolio Advisors Management. Thank you very much for taking the call live with us here this afternoon.
Thank you.
90 KBC, good afternoon. Stocks power back up with the Dow up 322 points here at the closing bell at 38,226. The S&P 500 moved to 46 points at 5,064, and the Nasdaq gained 235 at 15,841. The yield in the 10-year note is eased to 4.58%. Apple taking the after-hours spotlight, coming in with earnings that exceeded analysts' expectations. Apple also announced its board had authorized $110 billion in share repurchases, a 22% increase over last year's $90 billion authorization, the largest buyback in history ahead of Apple's previous repurchases. Overall sales down 4%. iPhone sales down 10% year over year during the quarter, which Apple attributed to a tough comparison versus last year. According to MarketWatch, on the earnings call with analysts, Apple's finance chief said the company expected the current quarter will deliver double-digit year-over-year percentage growth in iPad sales, and he said the services division is forecast to continue growing at about the current high rate it achieved during the past 2 quarters. The Apple said iPhone sales were down nearly 10% to, $45.96 billion, suggesting weak demand for the current generation of smartphones, which were released back in September. Mac sales were up 4% to $7.45 billion, but they're still below the segment's high watermark, which was set in 2022. Other products, which is how Apple reports sales of its Apple Watch and AirPods headphones, was down 10% year over year to $7.9 billion. Apple's still putting eye-popping numbers on the board, and Apple stock today did move up nearly $4 to $173 and change, after hours up about $10 a share. NVIDIA, the so-called Magnificent One, moving higher today by nearly $28 at $858.17. Paramount Global in the spotlight, up $1.60 at $13.86 on the latest buyout speculation. Latest report says Sony Pictures and private equity firm Apollo Global Management have sent a letter to Paramount Global's board expressing interest in acquiring the company for about $26 billion. The price of oil moving higher by 22 cents at $79.17 here in after-hours trading. Gold moving higher by nearly $5 at $2,314.30 an ounce. Checking the cryptos now, we see Bitcoin bouncing around quite a bit lately, and right now just above $59,000, down about $70 to $59,262. Ethereum up 14 at $3,001, and Doge at 13 cents. Coming up, let's discuss what's happening at the local college campuses with the Honorable Dennis Zine, former Los Angeles City Council member, former LAPD sergeant and current reserve officer with the LAPD. Dennis Zine will be on the line coming up later this hour, and a lot of China news today as well, and I'll discuss that with our go-to China expert, Gordon Chang, on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Gordon G. Chang, author of numerous books, and of course, well-known on the major networks as well as local and international newspapers. Gordon Chang will be with us and a frequent contributor on this program, which, of course, we greatly appreciate. Mottek On Money continues here, 790 KBC, a positive day for the stock market. And we'll be getting the big enchilada monthly economic reports tomorrow, and that'll be the jobs report for the month of April. Well, no selling in May and going away today for the stock market. The Dow moved higher a day after we had a bouncy session. It's been a volatile week with some big moves on the upside as well as the downside today. A triple-digit gain for the Dow of 322 points at 38,226. The S&P 500 moved up 46 points at 5,064. And the NASDAQ gained 235 points at 15,841. The yield in the 10-year note has eased to 4.58%. Mortgage rates still elevated at or near the high point of 2024. Apple coming out with better than expected results, and the stock is moving about $10 higher in after-hours trading to up around 183. We're watching the cryptos bounce around here. This is always a lot of fun, given what's happening this year with the crypto space, with Bitcoin hitting an all-time high recently and then pulling back. Of course, the stock market also hit record highs earlier this year, but it's seen a losing month of April that just concluded this week, and we're keeping an eye on all of that very, very closely. Let's take a look here at what the cryptos are doing here at this moment. But right now, we'll check that in just a second here. I'm delighted to say now we're going to go back to one of our other top stories here, and that is what's happening on college campuses. It's day 210 of the war between Israel and Hamas, which started October 7th. After Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, leaving at least 1,200 people dead and more than 100 people still being held hostage. At UCLA, police removed barricades and began dismantling anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian fortified encampments today at the UCLA campus after hundreds of protesters defied police orders to leave about a day after counter-protesters attacked a tent encampment on the campus. Joining us live now, the Honorable Dennis ZINE, former Los Angeles City Council member, former LAPD sergeant, and still LAPD reserve officer with about 56 years of service to the City of Angels. Dennis ZINE is on the line. Dennis, thank you very much for taking the call here. Give us your reaction to what's been happening at UCLA, first of all.
Well, Frank, good afternoon to you and the KBC listeners. What's happening is now the finger-pointing begins. Now that everything has subsided, the California Highway Patrol, LAPD, Sheriff's Department, allied agency, now that peace and tranquility is present at the UCLA, now the finger-pointing. Who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for that? This is a typical situation. The bottom line is law enforcement went in and they waited many, many hours, hundreds of officers, and they finally cleaned the place out early this morning, and now we've got what is back to UCLA, an institution of learning. But the finger pointing from different elements of government, who did this and who did that, the bottom line is the police officers, the Highway Patrol officers, the LA County Sheriff's deputies, they did the job that should have been done when that camp was first established. And if that was the case, we wouldn't be at this particular situation where all these folks went to jail, and they all have to go through the criminal process now, the criminal justice system. But there were definitely students that were and faculty involved in this. But I want to also comment that there were outside activists that penetrated, and there are people who instigate and they focus on an issue, and then they generate controversy and confrontation with law enforcement. I will also say when I saw the Highway Patrol officers and they brought officers in from different parts of the state of California, a massive show of California Highway Patrol officers in body armor. I'd never seen them in that particular equipment, but they did a tremendous job cleaning this out and reestablishing order. And the trash, just incredible amounts of trash have been thrown out. UCLA will return to what it needs to be, an institution of education, learning, and accomplishment. So I commend the police, I commend the Sheriff's Department, the California Patrol, and the people who are students who want to get an education and go to UCLA to achieve that education and be a productive member of society. But it's terrible what we saw happen there, the protest, the anti-protest, and hopefully people will come to understanding if you have a concern, then do it in a legitimate, fair, equitable manner and not protest and create havoc to a community that doesn't need that type of situation.
Right, we've seen the reports, outside funding as well. I don't know if you saw the New York Post article. Part of it said Israel hate camps explode. funded by George Soros and his hard left acolytes. They say paying agitators who are fueling the
how wrestling really works and how you get the ratings. Eric Bischoff and Conrad Thompson explain on 83 Weeks.
This is indeed the first WrestleMania without Vince McMahon.
I mean, it's about as horrible as it can get, but does erasing that history make it any better?
Everybody's being careful not to celebrate Vince McMahon. I think you can acknowledge him without celebrating him. I think that's the double-edged sword that everybody's sort of carrying for now.
83 Weeks on YouTube or wherever you listen.
Explosion of radical anti-Israel protests at colleges across the country. Are you able to give us any insights as to what's happening on the ground here and how these groups may be funded?
Well, there's no question that they're getting funding, and Soros is notorious for this type of activity. Soros is the one who funded our current district attorney, George Gascon, who I hope people will realize he needs to go in November when the election takes place. But Soros is trying to undermine what we have here in America. He wants to undermine anything and everything that we, natives of this country, I'm a native Angelino, he wants to turn that upside down. He advocates for that, and he has a lot of funding, and he does that. So he'll take a cause, and what we see happening from the East Coast to the West Coast with these universities that are going through this crisis. This is not necessary. The students need to get educated, the professors need to educate, and the facility needs to be peace and tranquility. But I would not put anything past George Soros to disrupt what we in America have, peace, harmony, happiness. And anytime he can obstruct that and counter that, he does. And obviously what we hear is that he's done it once again. People need to recognize the evil that George Soros represents in America.
On there live with Dennis ZINE, and we've seen Governor Newsom, as you mentioned, the finger pointing has started, saying the limited and delayed campus law enforcement responses at UCLA the other night was unacceptable, and he's demanding an investigation. We saw Mayor Bass cut her visit to Washington short this week, and what do you think is going to come of that now?
Well, there'll be investigations, and I was following this from the initial stage when three officers from the UCLA Police Department arrived, and they left. They didn't call for assistance. They didn't call for mutual aid. They left. I don't know how that ever happened, and that's when we saw the fights break out. There were a number of fights that broke out. No law enforcement anywhere. People were saying, we're calling 911. No one's responding. The UCLA Police Department is the primary responsibility. It's not LAPD. It's not Sheriff's Department. It is UCLA Police Department. They have a full-time police department with officers who are trained, licensed to do the job. They didn't do the job. How that happened, I don't know. But the fact is that's where the investigation needs to be focused. Why didn't they call for the Highway Patrol, mutual aid, etc.? Ultimately, that happened, but it happened way too late. And the consequence is people going to jail, the expenditure of so many. This costs millions of dollars as far as the deployment of personnel from the different agencies, LAPD, Sheriff's Department, Highway Patrol, et cetera, even the Beverly Hills, Culver City, other departments were involved under mutual aid. So if they would have done the job, and that's their responsibility, something goes down, if you can't handle it, you call for mutual aid, you call for assistance. Apparently, what I saw and what I witnessed on television news and what actually happened is that wasn't done. So there'll be a lot of finger pointing, but the fact is that California Highway Patrol, those folks did a tremendous job bringing tranquility. And I got calls this morning at 3:30 in the morning from the media to comment on this, and I was watching it. California Patrol went in and they dismantled that activity. People got arrested. If they wanted to walk away, they could. So congratulations to what's happened. But now there'll be many investigations, much finger pointing. The bottom line is I think you'll see some change in administration at UCLA, not only the administration, but in the law enforcement focus at UCLA.
And under the soft on crime DA, what's going to happen to these people?
Well, if it's a felony charge, he will then be able to prosecute. But I think most of them will be charged with a misdemeanor, which will go through the city attorney's office. And oftentimes, a case like this, they find alternatives. They're not going to go to jail. They may find a fine or probation or something to the effect. But all these folks that were involved in it, and I will say many of them not students, professional agitators, and maybe funded by Soros, as we have heard, they will go through the system, and I think very few will go to jail. Will they learn anything from this? Probably not. Will Soros learn anything from this? No. But it does try to kill the fabric, tear the fabric of America, what America represents, what it means. And as far as this international situation with this war, I'm not an advocate of war. This needs to come to an end. It's a national thing. It's not a local thing. UCLA, SC, they're not going to have any participation in it. This is national. Our senators, our president, our Congress, those are the folks that have to come to an end on this and not take it down to disruption that they've caused, not only at this particular university, but universities across the country.
And leadership has also been called into question in all of this, not only at the universities, but also at the city and state level. What are your observations about how this whole situation has been handled here?
Well, the governor's responsible. The UCLA is a state university. The governor, the state senators, the state legislators, it's a state facility. It's not local. It's not like Pepperdine, which is private. It's not like USC. This is a state facility, University of California, and university is responsible along with the state officials. So the board of the university is responsible. There'll be multiple investigations. The bottom line is the ball was dropped when they first gathered there. And unlike what SC did, SC, when they showed up, they brought in the police and they dismantled it and they sent everybody on their way. You didn't see that kind of situation happen here. When you let this fester, and that's what they let it fester, this is what happened when it got out of control. And it clearly got out of control. But when you saw the deployment of police personnel, highway patrol, sheriffs, etc., you're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars in personnel resources. And then people who needed 911 who called and no one's responding, all those folks were deployed from their regular assignments. So there was a jeopardy to the general public where police didn't have the resources because they were focused on this incident, which they had to clean up, and they needed enough personnel to make sure the officers were safe. So there'll be multiple investigations. The bottom line is the ball was dropped at UCLA, and they're the ones who are ultimately responsible and accountable. And the governor's going to do what he wants to do. I don't think the mayor needed to come back from Washington, D.C., because it's not a city of Los Angeles situation. It's a state of California situation. It's a state university on state property.
And in the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Southern California taxpayer picking up the tab for all this unbelievable. Dennis Zine, thank you very much for taking the call here. The Honorable Dennis Zine, former Los Angeles City Council member, former LAPD sergeant, still an LAPD reserve officer, serving the city of Angels for at least 56 years, as I counted. Dennis Zine was on the line. Thank you very much, Dennis, for joining us live here.
Thank you, Frank.
Folks, people like you and me have our ear to the ground on all things business. We like to be informed and indeed well prepared. As important as finance is, I want you to have a plan in case you're hit by someone not paying attention to the road. Thinking ahead serves us well, but even still, we can get caught off guard as people are so focused on their destination that they might not have a plan if they're in an accident that's not their fault. That's why I encourage you to put my friend Attorney Clark Fielding's number in your phone. That number is 833-88-SHARK. So if you're in an accident, you'll be ready with your strategy to make Clark Fielding your very first call. Fielding Law aims for the highest possible settlement, considering you might need long-term care, rehab, compensation for lost wages, and any ongoing physical or emotional pain. So if you're hurt in any kind of accident, call for a free consultation with Fielding Law. You can trust them. They're honest, respected, and your strategy in case you get into that unexpected accident. Motorcycle, truck, pedestrian, scooter, hit-and-run boating, or bike accidents, you name it, the number to call 833-88-SHARK. That's 833-88-SHARK, or go to clarkthesharklaw.com. Mottek On Money continues here, 790 KBC. The United States now imposing sanctions on more than a dozen companies in China and Hong Kong for their support of Russia's war in Ukraine as part of an effort. 300 new sanctions were unveiled this week, the move coming after repeated warnings from top U.S. authorities, including Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to top Chinese authorities about this issue. Let's bring in our go-to China expert now, Gordon Chang, China expert and author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War, and on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon Chang, thanks very much for taking the call. China helping shift the battlefield momentum in Russia's favor in Ukraine by providing it with components and other material needed to sustain its defense industry, according to top intelligence officials we heard from today. And now these sanctions are also imposed. Give us your reaction to this latest news here.
Well, it's interesting, Frank, that the sanctions were imposed so soon after Secretary of State Antony Blinken left Beijing. But the issue here is really the severity of the sanctions, because they really are quite minor. What is going to make China think twice will be sanctions on the Chinese banks. And today,
They did not sanction the banks. Perhaps that's what the Biden administration is going to do down the road if China doesn't change its behavior. But right now, I don't think that the Chinese have seen anything that is going to make them stop their support for the Russian war effort.
All right, so these sanctions involving various companies in China and Hong Kong, hoping to the administration hoping to crack down on China's provision of dual-use items to Russia that the U.S. says are being used to strengthen its military in the war against Ukraine. Maybe you can explain for us what's really happening there.
Well, from the very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Beijing has been backing Moscow, and it's been doing so with forms of assistance that could be described as lethal. Now, the Biden administration has continually warned China about lethal aid, and China has continued to ignore those warnings, which is the reason why Secretary Yellen and Secretary Blinken, in very quick succession, warned China in their visits to the Chinese capital. And what's going on, I think, right now is the Biden administration wants to turn up the heat, but only slowly, in the sense that trying to give China a chance to back out gracefully.
All right, and we did hear from the Director of National Intelligence today at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on this issue. Beijing's assistance coming as Russian forces make progress in Ukraine and attempts to ratchet up pressure on Ukraine by bombing the country's critical infrastructure. So it appears we're at a critical point in the war there at the moment.
Well, yes. Russia has been able to take advantage of the lull in shipments from the United States and others to Ukraine. But now the U.S. is delivering equipment, and some of the missiles that are being put into Ukraine's hands can actually hit the Russians in Crimea, which so far has effectively been a sanctuary. But with these long-range attack of missiles, I think that essentially we're going to see the war shift back in Ukraine's favor.
Another report I want to get your reaction to, and that is the Associated Press reporting President Biden has called Japan and India xenophobic countries that do not welcome immigrants, lumping the two with adversaries China and Russia as he tried to explain their economic circumstances and contrasted the four with the U.S. on immigration. This is getting a lot of attention, and your reaction to that?
These comments were really at the wrong time. The United States depends upon Japan, and one can even argue that at this moment, Japan is the most important ally of the United States. Whatever one thinks about Japan's policies towards foreigners, this was not the time to say that.
And this coming just after the White House had hosted the Japanese Prime Minister for an official visit, and that was a celebration where the president called this an unbreakable alliance, and then suddenly these comments now.
Yes, well, Prime Minister Kishida on the 11th of last month was in the White House with Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippine president. And this was the first ever trilateral summit among Japan, Philippines, and the United States.
Gordon Chang, thank you very much for always joining us with your enlightening commentary and analysis. That is Gordon Chang, China expert and author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War, and on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Gordon G. Chang. This is Mottek On Money on 790 KBC.
What's up, everyone? It's Reality Steve, your number one source for all things Bachelor Nation and reality TV. Every day, I'm giving you the behind-the-scenes juice and your info on all your Bachelor Nation stories, and also interviewing some of your favorite reality stars. My name has been synonymous with spoilers, but I'm so much more than that. Give me a listen.
The Reality Steve Podcast, part of the Believe Network. Just search BLEAV on YouTube or wherever you listen.